Okay, like to welcome everybody to this fifth seminar, and our theme today is livelihood and employment. And you should have looked at the presentation that we put up last week and looked at the course book, and I hope tried some of the follow-on activities. But we're going to run over that theme today. So I'm just going to put my PowerPoint up so that everybody can see what's going on. Right. And that's the one I want. Okay. So welcome everyone. Can I just say about the chat, if you want to send a message to Gemma, just send it to her, don't send it to everybody. Can you refrain from using the chat unless it's an emergency to get something from Gemma, and we don't need everybody saying hello to each other. We're reserving the chat for the chat sessions, which if we stick to time, we should have 3 today. So this is really about consolidating what was in the presentation and giving some more thought for it. With me today is Sarah Kamau, who's our acting chair from Kenya, and I'm handing over to Sarah now to introduce this seminar.
Thank you, Richard. Welcome participants to this session of Module 5. I want to start by introducing the session and say that disabled people in all countries, especially in low and middle income countries, are likely to be found amongst the poorest. A vicious cycle of barriers, of exclusion, isolation, lack of education training, work or livelihood reinforcement, reinforce the disadvantaged position disabled people experience. Governments are to abide by the treaties they have signed and ratified, such as UNCRPD, Article 27, and Sustainable Development Goals, number 8 especially, have to legislate, provide welfare, education, training, raise awareness, and ensure employers, including themselves, are effectively addressing barriers to equalize the position of disabled people. The loss of livelihood to the individuals and to the economics of their countries by the non-engagement of disabled people is both an ongoing human rights abuse as well as an economic loss for these countries. A sense of achievement is important to all human beings, and we know that with reasonable accommodation and support, disabled employees are as productive and effective as anyone and are often more reliable than non-disabled employees. Microfinances and organizations like cooperatives in agriculture and other self-employed activities, alongside assistive devices, can make all the difference to all self-employed disabled people and their families. As we demonstrate, all arguments and barriers that hinder the employment of disabled people can be addressed, and the actions to address the current employment gaps and challenges are well known and have been shown to be effective. What is needed is a major renewed effort on behalf of state parties, employers, civil societies to implement what has already been made and committed to.
Thank you. And now I'll pass you on to talk about the language we use.
I'll go on to talk about the language the Commonwealth Disabled Peoples Forum use for the sake of conceptualization of these seminars and course. We choose to use the word disabled people, and why we still choose to call ourselves disabled people. In the Commonwealth Disabled People Forum, we call ourselves disabled people because of the development of the social model of disability. In the 19th and the 20th century, a person's medical condition was thought to be the root cause of their exclusion from society, an approach now referred to as the medical or individual model of disability. We use the social model of disability where the barriers of environment, attitude, organization are what disable people with impairments and lead to prejudice and discrimination. So to call ourselves persons with disabilities is to accept that we are objects and are powerless, which is not the case. We also view ourselves as united by a common oppression, so are proud to identify as disabled people rather than people with disabilities. When you're talking about the UNCRPD, we shall use the term persons with disabilities or people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sue. And we'll come back to you in a bit. So we saw a film in the presentation about the so-called vicious circle of poverty and disability. And this needs unpacking a little bit, we think. This is a model that came from DFID. We're one of the first to do it, Department for International Development in the UK, now called the Department for Commonwealth and Development, Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. So in the outer circle, you've got disability, which leads to poverty, which leads to vulnerability to poverty and ill health, which leads to more disability, and it goes on. And then internal mechanisms to that are social and cultural exclusion and stigma, which certainly exists, denial of opportunities for economic and social and human development, deficits in economic, social and cultural rights, and reduced participation in decision-making and denial of civil and political rights. But is this something that is unique to disabled people, is the question I want to try and answer in the next few slides. Or is it something that we need to think about more widely? And first of all, I've put up now, for those who can't see the screen, a map of the world based on the population numbers in 2018. So each million or billion people is a little square, and they're in roughly the same place and the same shape as the countries of the world. But clearly, some countries are much bigger than their geographic area because they have much bigger populations. And the two largest countries by population are China and India. China with 1.4 billion, and this is in 2018, it was, and India with 1.354 billion. And these are very large. Next to them is Pakistan with 200 million and Bangladesh 166 million. And then also quite large in Asia, we have the 145 million in Indonesia, 106 million in Philippines, and Japan 127 million. And then a lot of smaller countries, but still quite big. Thailand, 69 million, Myanmar, 53 million, Vietnam, 96 million. So not small countries by any means. And then as we move across, we find that on a normal map, you will find Russia across 7 time zones, or is it 9 time zones, I think, is much smaller because it's only 144 million people. And that's next to Europe, which has various countries, the largest of which is 82 million in Germany, 62 million France, 66 million the UK, 59 million Italy, and so on. Spain, 46 million. Turkey, bigger than many people think, 81 million. Iran, also a large country by population, or what used to be Persia, 82 million. When we come south across the Mediterranean to look at Africa, there is 1.1 billion people in Africa, but they're split up into over 60 countries. So the big countries there are Nigeria, 195 million, the Congo, 84 million, South Africa, 57 million, Kenya, 51 million, Ethiopia, 107 million, and Egypt, 99 million, and others, many others smaller than that, but it's still quite a big part of the map because there are a lot of people in Africa. We cross the Atlantic, there's some smaller islands of the Caribbean and so on, the largest of which is Cuba with 11 million. And then we see the United States, quite large with 326 million, and a tiny small pink ribbon of 37 million for Canada, and Mexico 130 million. And then Brazil down in South America, 210 million. And we then have smaller countries like Argentina, 44 million, and Chile, only 18 million, Colombia, 49 million. Bolivia, we can hardly see on that map, which is interesting because it's got a small population, but we're going to be talking about Bolivia, 11.2 million, as one of our case studies. So if you keep that in your mind as the general distribution of population. And interesting there, Australia hardly figures, and New Zealand hardly figures there, but between them, the whole of Oceania is 41 million people, including Australia, New Zealand, and all the Pacific Islands, nearly all of whom are part of the Commonwealth. So when we get that picture, then look, based on that, who are the members of the G7, the big powerful groups? Well, you've got India, you've got China there, you've got the United States, Canada, France, Italy, UK. It's not really based on population. So what is it based on? Well, let's have a look at another map. Now, this is quite a complicated map. It's showing two things. It's showing the size of the total economy, the GDP, gross domestic product. So the country is drawn in proportion to its GDP, but then it's shaded in different colors from brown to dark red, orange, yellow, light green, dark green, turquoise, light blue, dark blue. And dark blue is where the population has the biggest amount of money per person. All right, and so that's the dimensions of this map. Again, they're in roughly the same places. These are called cartograms, if people don't know. They are to demonstrate the relationship of countries on a particular, or here, two different variables or ways of thinking. So as we'd expect, we've heard that China has been putting on a lot of economic growth, and it's not as big as the United States over on the other side there, but it's getting to be a lot bigger. And it's certainly about 3 times the size of India in terms of its economy. And over to the east of China is Japan, which is much larger than its geographic size, as is indeed South Korea, because these are economically doing very well, where Australia is much bigger than it was on the population, and even New Zealand is showing up. Singapore comes out, which is a very small country with only 5 million people. It comes out quite large here, much larger in some ways than Malaysia, or it's about the same size as Thailand. And then a lot of other countries are not featuring very much at all. India is there with all its states, but it's not very large. And there is nowhere that's above a yellow in terms per capita income. Remember that, because we'll come back to it. Then we've got the Arabian Peninsula as much larger, and that of course is from oil money, which has put these countries well up the economic league. And I'd say that the size of all of the Middle East countries there, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on, is about 2/3 the size of Africa in terms of its economy. Nigeria and South Africa and Egypt have the biggest economies, and a lot of the other countries, very small. South Africa comes out as the highest per capita income. Nigeria is red, and the others are red, brown, or so very poor. And the poorest countries we find in sub-Saharan Africa per capita income. The Middle East, Turkey and Iran, although quite big by population, are much smaller than they were by population. And the interesting thing here, again, Russia looks quite small here. It's not at all big. It's to the north of Turkey and Iran, but it's not very big at all. Moscow seems to have a bigger economy than much of the rest of Russia. Europe, of course, it's a big bloc, and many of the people, particularly in Northern Europe, the Scandinavian bloc, is much larger than their population size. And then the UK, with London having about 1/4 of the economy of the UK, and Ireland much larger than the population of Ireland, where there were only 4.5 million people, suddenly growing. And that's because a lot of multinational companies operating into Europe have located themselves there, so their economic gets counted into Ireland. Going across the Atlantic, we see that the Caribbean chain, very small, very little economic activity going on there. But Florida, just over from there, is huge. Texas, huge. California, massive. California, nearly the size of Africa in terms of its economy. And that's just one state in America. And then we find that actually the Canadian provinces are much larger than they were on population. So they're again having a high amount of income. Then when we come south to Mexico, Mexico City is quite large compared, but all the other provinces of Mexico are pretty small, and the Central American countries, very small indeed. When we get to Brazil, we find that the economy of Sao Paulo is actually bigger than nearly the rest of Brazil. And Argentina is quite large, much larger than Peru or Colombia. And the others are very small. And again, they're all in the green to yellow group. So where are the people who get a high income? And that, of course, doesn't mean, as we'll see in a moment, that everybody there is well off, because, of course, that isn't the case. If you wanted another map, we would have to have another map up, which we haven't got time for today, about how the income is distributed amongst the whole population. And to get an idea of that, we'll go to the next slide. This slide tells us some other information about poverty and wealth in the world. Extreme poverty versus extreme wealth. How big is the inequality gap? Well, the world's richest 1% have more than twice as much wealth as the 6.9 billion people of the rest of the world. So they have twice as much than the other 99%, which is quite interesting. Almost half of humanity is living on less than $5.50 a day. And how does that break down across countries? We've got here a series of bar charts with 3 lines on them. The light blue line, which is the wealthiest 1%, the 10% wealthiest, and then the 50% least wealthy in each group. So the first one is the Middle East, and we talked about that, the oil wealth there and so on, but there's still many poor people living there. The richest have come down somewhat, maybe as the price of oil has come down over the last 20 years, are not quite as rich, as the richer 10% has also come down. Whereas in fact, the poorest 50%, their income has gone up slightly. So there seems to have been some redistribution in the Middle East. In Brazil, which we talked about a minute ago, there's also been some redistribution. The poorest 50% from 2001 to 2015 has gone up. The top 10% has gone up and down, but is still on the way up. And that would have been the 2008 fall, economic crash that affected them, and similarly for the 1%. In India, which remember we're at nearly 1.4 billion people there, and the largest country in the Commonwealth, what we've seen there is a big increase from very low to quite substantially more of the top 10%, and the top 1% have really gone up astronomically. They've gone up but from holding 30% of the wealth to now holding 60% of the wealth. And the bottom 50%, which remember is about 700 million people, well, their income has come down from 1980 to 2013. So we can't say that all around the world, the gaps between the poorest and the richest are the same, or what's going on. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, all of those countries south of the Sahara, it's been level pegging, slightly down for the top 1%, slightly up for the top 10%, and for the bottom 50%, slightly up, but hardly up at all. It's more or less from the last 36 years remain more or less the same. The United States, well, we've seen what's been happening there, but this is before Trump, so we don't know what's happened to it since then, except we would say that the richest got richer and the poorest got poorer. So we know that that was the impact of his years. But before that, the richest 1% was still rising very considerably from holding about 30% to nearer to 50% of the income, and the top 10% rising, but not as fast. And the bottom 50% of people in the United States, that's half, more than 160 million people, their income has been steadily falling from 1980 to 2014. Russia, of course, went through a transition from being a state-planned economy to a free market economy. And we can see there that the impact of that from 1988, a huge drop in ordinary people's, the bottom 50% income, slowly picked up again from around 2000 to 2015. And equally, the top 1% who got given lots of companies for very small amounts of money to run. We know that many of them became millionaires overnight. Yes, it shows in the graph, and they went up, as did the 10%. In China, where there has been this enormous economic growth, we can see that the top 1% have gone up very considerably, although it's tailing off in the last, say, 8 years. And same for the top 10%. But the bottom 50%, and that is a large proportion, that's 700 million people, they have consistently dropped in their income from 1980 to 2015. Europe has been level pegging more or less, with the top 1% slightly rising from 1980 to 2016, and the bottom 50% going down slightly, but not very much, and the top 10% going up, and similarly reflected in France. So that gives us food for thought when we say this. Is there just a vicious cycle of poverty for disabled people? And it seems that there's a vicious cycle of poverty for an awful lot of people in the world. So is that model, the vicious cycle model that we looked at, too simplistic? Is it not actually measuring what's really happening out there? When disabled people living in poverty are asked what their most pressing needs are, surprise, surprise, the answers are rarely impairment specific. They are usually about things that other people would say. Both disability and poverty are symptoms of the way that society is organized, marginalized and isolating certain people. So the similarities there, clearly not all disabled people are poor and not all poor people are disabled. However, if there are such similarities between the characteristic of poverty and disability, not impairment, then perhaps the relationship would be better described, rather than a vicious cycle, as an interlocking circle. And often posed is the question, if you're a millionaire, but you say you're a paraplegic and you have an electric chair, an adapted house, adapted car, you have several people who look after your needs, are you disabled? Well, you're disabled, you have an impairment which stops you from doing a lot of things, but are you prejudiced against by the barriers beyond you? It's unlikely that you are, because you do have the wherewithal to overcome most of them. But in a basic way, perhaps the attitudinal way, in the way that people relate to each other, it's unlikely that you would have the sort of relationships that maybe you would have had as a non-disabled person. So maybe there is still a deficit there that we need to think about as disabled people. Even if we're the richest people in the world, maybe we're still at some deficit. The social model tells us it is the structures in society that disable us. So what model are we to look at? Disabled people need to be part of the wider movements for social justice and change, and that's important. The model that I put up now is a large circle, which is society, and then in the middle, what unites people who are both disabled and poor: marginalization, isolation, economic, social, and political deprivation, lack of access to education, employment, healthcare, legal and political processes, healthy food, adequate housing, and credit. So thinking back to that map of poverty around the world, there is much more that disabled people have in common with most people who are living in poverty than they don't have. But of course, there are some specific disability factors which may be additional to. So we're going to have a look at a few struggles to improve livelihood for disabled people, and then ask ourselves some questions in the chat. But let's have a look at these next two examples. First one, which I mentioned in the presentation, but I'm going to show you a bit of a film on this because I think it's a very impressive struggle. And it's not in the Commonwealth, it's in South America and Bolivia, but 125 people sat in for 60 days in a place about 120 miles over the Andes from their capital, La Paz, and then they marched over the Andes, or wheeled over the Andes to Murillo Square, the seat of government, and were met with massive police force. The president said they did not need a pension of £56 a month, which is the equivalent of 500 Bolivians, which is their currency, and they were campaigning for that to be given to everybody. I'll say the next bit after we've seen the film, although some of you may have seen it already. But what I'm going to do is commentate this as we go through, as it's in Spanish, and audio describe it. What we see first here is a grown man in a nappy who looks like he's got cerebral palsy, crawling across in front of the riot shields which say police. Now they're being sprayed with water cannon. The police behind their riot shields are advancing, using their truncheons, tipping disabled people out of their chairs, attacking them, wrestling with them, and the protesters are fighting back as much as they can. The water cannon, though, are drenching the protesters. Up comes the title, The Fight, La Pelea. And now we are at the beginning of the film. We see a van with the Bolivian flag, and behind it, pulling about 15 people in wheelchairs tied together along the road, followed by some people walking, some with a lopsided gait, others with a stick and a crutch, along a procession on the road. We've got to get over the highest point, says Felicia. They can rest for the night when we do that. It's April the 3rd, isn't it? No, it's the 4th of April. We've been on the road for 15 days. And we now have a long shot of them climbing up a slow incline. About 80 people on this caravan or march. Now they've pulled into a lay-by and are having a meeting. Before we took to the road, says the leader, Marcelo, we have tried to have our voice heard. We protested for 60 days. I hope that each one of you who has undertaken this journey has the strength to get there. They're in a circle. The goal is La Paz. The goal, the very thing we want, is 500 Bolivians, £56 monthly payment for all disabled people as a pension. There's nothing else, says Marcelo, and they all clap him. Now we're the next day, and we're seeing the marchers getting ready behind their van to go out on the road again. Now they're going up a steep incline. From our vulnerability, we get stronger, says one marcher. Now we see from the front of the march, someone with a flag. They've now reached the highest point, 4,020 meters above sea level. And that is up high. They're crossing now a viaduct, and you can see the whole march. They're collecting money from lorries that are happy to give them it. We'll arrive at the seat, says a woman, at the seat of government. Next to her is a blind person with a guide dog and 2 other wheelchairs. Now we're down on the flat, and we'll arrive at the seat. People are finding it easier now to push along their wheelchairs straight on for La Paz, says the road sign. Rosemary Garritia saying, strength, strength, brothers. Go slowly, no need to hurry. We have to keep a calm rhythm. So they're marching now down the road, a slow incline into La Paz. You can see the mountains with snow on beyond, and quite a large city. The march has now swelled to many hundreds, if not thousands. They've been joined by many organizations of disabled people, trade unionists, and others, tenants associations in the capital. And they're amazed that so many people, after 35 days, the caravan arrives in La Paz, and there are thousands of people marching with them. We've come here to fight for our 500 Bolivian pension for all people with disabilities. And there's a whole series of them feeling proud that they've got there. Marcelo says, I'm tired. I'm really tired. If a bed came by right now, I'd crawl into it and sleep. Put this on. They're encamping now in one of the city streets. I'm going to move it on a little bit to the next day, and they're going up from their camp towards Murillo Square. They've had their breakfast and they're ready to go to present their petition to the president in Plaza Murillo, but it's barricaded with 2-meter high barricades with riot police behind. And there are lots of police and security forces around behind the fences. They don't want any contact between us and them. Friends, the government has told society that we are a threat. All we want is our pension, says Murillo. They've barricaded Plaza Murillo, so now we have to try and get in. They go up against the fences. And what we see now is some really amazing treatment as meted out to the protesters. As they come up to the barricade, one man, disabled man, carrying a wooden cross to demonstrate his burden. The fight is hard, says the leader, but we must persist. Now they're up against a 2-meter fence. They're pushing against it with their wheelchairs, but not in vain, because the national television is there filming them. The media are there recording what is going on. They're pushing against the fence. It moves a little bit, and now they're going to pull it out a bit, the fence, and they've done that, but immediately one of the security guards comes through with pepper spray into their eyes. So this is quite harsh treatment that is going on here. They're trying to push the fence up more, but more pepper spray onto their faces. This is a hard struggle, and they stay for another 2 months trying to get through. The president increasingly saying they're trying to bring down democracy, they're trying to attack him, when actually all they're asking for is their pension. A bit later on, motorbikes from the police and the army go through the protesters. They're water cannon sprayed, they're attacked, many arrested. They develop tactics of hanging from overpass in their wheelchairs. And then one night, a vehicle drives through their camp and kills 2 and injures 7. And that perhaps was a turning point when that happened, because soon after that, they went home, and the president then agreed not to the full pension that they were asking for, but for half of it for those who were more severely disabled. But that's half of more than they had before. Now, another country where livelihood has been secured, but in a different way, through a democratic change of government, was the Rainbow Coalition Constitution of South Africa, which came in committed to equality for all. And there we have a different story.
South Africa, 7.5% of the population lives with a disability. According to the 2020 census, the government provides a disability grant for all adults over 18. This is rare in sub-Saharan Africa and given South Africa's status as a middle-income country. All grants are payable to citizens, permanent residents, and refugees with legal status.
The challenge I am faced with here in my home, I'm disabled, he's got a spinal injury and can't walk. I'm paralyzed, he says. My wife helps me with everything. She does the everyday work around the house. I send her to the shop, she cooks for me, and she bathes me. So he's saying how
only one available for persons of working age, and also covers persons with chronic illnesses such as HIV/AIDS. To access their grants, beneficiaries of the disability grant use their smart card issued by SASSA, which is the South African Social Security Agency. SASSA uses the biometric system to register the beneficiaries as well as their caregivers.
Disability grants are one of our biggest challenges, in the sense that a lot of fraud is committed amongst that. You would know that generally if unemployment is high and people need to access services, they attempt to think of themselves or render themselves disabled And some of the conditions that they would bring forward, like sort of hypertension does not necessarily make you disabled, of course. It is a chronic condition, but if controlled through diet and exercise, of course, you'll be able to still work, because many people within the open labor market are able to work with such conditions. And I think we've put in a lot of measures in place in terms of quality control around the management of disabilities, but more quality assurance on the technical nature in terms of where doctors have made assessments. We would bring in independent doctors to be able to assess those assessments to ensure that the person who was assessed accordingly is in fact disabled and is in fact eligible for the grant.
There are 3 payment channels that beneficiaries can choose from, namely electronic bank transfer, cash payment at SASSA offices and at various points of sale such as supermarkets. Cash payments at local offices are made during the first half of each month, while electronic payments are available from the first day of each month. Caretakers can collect on behalf of those who are immobile due to chronic illnesses and disability.
Annual disability grant
Right now, I get the disability grant. On the day of the disability grant benefit, I give my wife the card. She collects the benefit, and we buy food for the children, and the maize meal. It makes a big difference.
Persons with disabilities. It requires the government to offer assistance in the form of a disability grant. This grant contributes to improving the income security of 2.8 million people living with disabilities in South Africa. With this grant, the government of South Africa is taking an important step to building a national social protection floor in line with the ILO's Recommendation 202 on national floors of social protection. To learn more about the recommendation, as well as South Africa.
Okay, we're going to go on now to do our first activity of the session. There are 3 questions here, so I'll read them through, and then if you can number your answers in the chat, Gemma will read them out and we'll see if a few of you can actually speak to them as well. So for disabled people, how are the barriers to the means to live similar to other poor people in your country? And the second question, how are the barriers for disabled people struggling to live different to those faced by other poor people in your country? So we're looking at those 2, 1 and 2 first. We'll come on to 3 afterwards. So if you can give us your answers for 1 and 2. 1, how are disabled people and other poor people similarly treated? What are the barriers for both of them? And 2, what are the barriers that are different from disabled people struggling to live differently? How are they different from other poor people? So we're testing out that model that we put up. Do we have more things in common with poor people, or what things make disabled people different from other poor people? Thank you. I'll give you a minute or 2 to come up with your answers. I hope people are putting their answers in the chat. Give another 30 seconds and then we'll start reading them out. Okay, Gemma, do you want to have a look what we've got coming in?
I'm having a look. So Laurie, our friend Laurie, says extra barriers, not just being poor. Lack of accessibility and inclusion. I think barriers include stigmatization, barrier and discrimination. So this probably applies to both. Okay. Somebody in Canada. Number one, many disabled people struggle to afford basic needs. Number two, additional barriers in communication environments. They are similar in that the opportunities and rights granted to persons with disabilities in other countries are of the same lacking participative nature, and South Africa, hence you witness the government giving grants to individuals who are unable to work due to their disability. Now I've got quite a lot coming in now, so just bear with me a moment. Grace says of number two, people with disabilities have perhaps to face more barriers along with poverty. For example, the accessibility and inclusion in jobs, transport to jobs, communication and general stigma. Disabled people may simply face an immediate barrier of not having anyone to collect their benefit or grant. Also, they're handing over independence and have to fully trust in any person they ask to collect that. Let me whiz down a bit. In Trinidad and Tobago, there is a need to have universal design on the public transport buses in order to allow equal access for persons with disabilities. Similarly, poor people in rural areas rely on the regularity of public transport for their transportation needs. Susan in Uganda said discrimination, hence not being included. Fiona in Uganda, in my country, both poor people and disabled people have difficulty in accessing good medical services in government hospitals. You hardly get drugs with or without disability as long as you are poor. People with disabilities face more barriers of access, such as access to an education or basic information free to all citizens.
The consensus seems to be that there are a lot of similarities, but then as disabled people, we have extra barriers around the area of stigma, lack of physical access, lack of communication systems. And so there's a sort of extra layer on top of what most people who are poor and are not disabled are facing. So that looks quite interesting. So now let's have a go at number three, and then on that number three, I might take some people to come in. What three things would lead to greater equality in the livelihoods for disabled people in your country? What three things would lead to greater equality in livelihoods for disabled people in your country? So if you can have a go at that now, number three. I'll give you a minute to get that done and then come round, people. Okay, have we got anything coming in yet on number 3?
Yeah, we do. I also have somebody that wants to sign his answer. So
Okay, we'll come on to them in a minute.
We'll come on to them in a minute. So
Okay.
when we've got both signers, we could do that. Okay, so what do we have? We have Rachel in Zambia said accessibility, working policies, awarding disabled people a percentage for every employment opportunity. Abubakar in Nigeria says access to healthcare, full inclusion, and create awareness and reasonable accommodation for them. We've got improved social protection for disabled people. We've got access to education through inclusive planning. We've got sensitization. We have accommodative, I think means accommodative infrastructures and inclusion and participation of disabled people.
Accommodative, I think that's.
Accommodative, yeah, accommodative infrastructures and inclusion and participation of disabled people. Amy said greater advocacies by DPOs, changing language in legislation.
Where's Amy from?
Amy's from Canada.
Okay.
We've got Leslie Ann Huggins. I think it's Trinidad. Legislation similar to that of Jamaica that secures a percentage of jobs for qualified disabled people.
So a quota thing,
I guess. And in Kenya, capacity building from grassroots level. Improved social protection for disabled people.
Let's hear from Leslie in Trinidad first, and then we'll go to the deaf guy.
Okay, hold on. Leslie Ann. Leslie Ann, are you able to unmute? You're unmuted, Leslie Ann. Do you want to come in?
Hi, Leslie. Do you want to say a bit more about the position you were putting forward for? Do you mean quotas in terms of jobs? Is that what you mean?
Hello, pleasant good day.
Yes, hello there.
Are you seeing me? My name is Leslie Ann Huggins. Thank you for having me. I was very impressed to see that Jamaica had gone that far to put aside a quota of the jobs for disabled people who were qualified. In Trinidad and Tobago, the universities, such as the University of the West Indies, has made provisions for disabled people to have education. However, there's a need to have government support so that we could have jobs after we have been qualified. There's also a need for full inclusion in healthcare for access for persons with disabilities and legislation and roundtable discussions that include persons with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have we got this link with the person who wants to sign us something?
I think we need a second interpreter.
We'll go on a bit more then.
Okay, there is somebody with their hand up.
Okay, if they want to.
Ristikat.
Sorry, Sarah, the deaf person's here on the screen.
Yes. Do we need a second interpreter? Or
it's okay. Well, hopefully, we'll see how we go.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Responsible for civil registration in documents and report on proceedings and outcomes of the 7th meeting of the Statistical Commission for Africa.
In relation to access in Nigeria, many hospitals have no access to interpreters, none at all. So deaf people enter the system, the hospital, and they write on pen and paper, they try and communicate that way. But some deaf people don't have that written ability. So it should be the responsibility of the hospital to supply interpreters. And secondly,
operationalization of the HCT. 3, support IDEP with adequate resources to enable the institute effectively to describe.
Okay, so in the office space, when deaf people are there, it's communicating in the workplace. I think what he's saying also in church as well. So sometimes it's difficult for deaf people to participate on an equal basis, and also when it comes to voting too. So, and doctors as well.
Necessary for sustainable development. To strengthen its collaboration.
Well, I think that's really useful.
Sorry, this is more the caption. I'm very difficult to capture with two voices. I don't know what that noise in the background is.
In the background.
Okay.
I don't know where that's coming from actually, because our man is muted.
Yeah,
Actually muted, so I don't know where the radio is coming from, and I can't tell, I'm afraid, because there's no other.
If anyone has got a radio on in the background, can they turn it off, please?
There's no other mics on here, so I don't know where that's coming from.
Okay.
Okay. It's going to be hard, but stop now. Okay, so I think that's been a useful roundup. So let's press on now to look at the key thing about how disabled people can get beyond just living on the basic social security network net that will save them from starvation, which, you know, is a pension, or as we saw in South Africa, 2.8 million people. But as a lot of people in South Africa would say, well, we want to be part of the workforce. We don't want to just be getting money from the government. And there is, of course, a different argument that disabled people put forward in Europe and in the UK in particular, which is actually there's an extra cost to being disabled. And while we're working, we would still like some support from the government. But of course, that's in the higher income countries that you will find that. But Article 28 says that all governments should provide some sort of support for people in terms of social security and so on. Now we're going on to look at SDG 8 for full good value jobs, and Article 27, employment of the UN Convention, employment for all. And of course, the right to work has been an established human right, as we saw from Module 1 right from the beginning in 1948. Yet around the world, most disabled people are not in work, with women more significantly affected than others. So historically, disabled people's organizations have had to fight for this. And it hasn't just been in the last 30 years. The record of history goes back 100, 120 years where, for instance, blind people marched to be paid the same as other people, where they were in charity-run sheltered workshops and often being exploited. They felt they should be paid the same rate of work pay as others. And so we see some protests on the slide of people who argued for this. In order to work, we need training to get ready for the workplace. And so one example which we'll look at now is in Sri Lanka, where there is a specialist training and disability resource center. And I did an interview there with Manik Garanathrana, who runs it, a visually impaired person who runs the center. And the interesting thing about the center in Sri Lanka, it still bears the colonial name of the Employers Federation of Ceylon, because of course it was at that time a British colony. And the training center has been going for the last 11 years, but the Employers Federation started in 1929. So they have the benefit of being at the center of a network of more than 700 employers who form part of an employers network on disability. And I think this is really important. No good just being trained if you don't have job opportunities to go into. And we saw in the film from Safari, the telecoms company from Kenya, how they had actually got rid of many of the barriers and were employing a lot of disabled people. So you need the employers to step up and say, yes, we'll create job opportunities for people once they have had the training. So there's a question mark about how much of this training is useful, because you can just go around from one training to the next. So let's see what our person in Sri Lanka says about this. Okay. I'm very pleased to be talking with Maneet Garatna, who runs a centre for disabled people developing skills for employment in Sri Lanka, and she's going to contribute to our module on employment. And so the first question really, what is the position of disabled people in Sri Lanka as regards employment and self-employment?
In Sri Lanka, when it comes to people with disabilities, we have the government gazette notification saying that 3% of government reservations should be for people with disabilities. But when it's come to implementation, there are gaps. I'm working at the Employers Federation of Ceylon, where we have 700 plus employers. So we have initiated the Employers Network on Disability to provide employment opportunities for people with disabilities in the private sector. So we are doing a lot of awareness program for employers. We are sensitizing the employers on how to make an inclusive workplace. And we are training people with disabilities to develop their employability skills. And then we do the proper job match. So if I am to state the status of people with disabilities in Sri Lanka, according to statistics, only about 21% are economically active. So we have to work more on it to give more employment opportunities for people with disabilities. People in the very grassroots level or in rural areas, they are mostly on doing either self-employment. So we are, doing programs to upgrade the self-employment and to develop them into entrepreneurs with disabilities, which is very important. So gave livelihood activities and various other trainings and activities are done to promote employment opportunities or develop entrepreneurs with disabilities to develop their skills and be gainfully employed.
Very good. So what do you think are the main barriers that lead to this only 21%, that's 79% not economically active of disabled people who work in aid? So what are the main barriers that they're up against in Sri Lankan society?
Now, when it's come to people with disabilities, they lack in skills, lack in employability skills. Because when they go for school and universities, they develop their academic qualifications. But to be employed, you must have the professional skills. Plus, education level should be high as well. You must have academic qualifications, that I agree. But you must have professional qualifications. Because to work in private sector, the language skills and the soft skills, the technology skills is very important. So lack of knowledge in English, because people with disabilities come from the very grassroots level. So one barrier is that, the language barrier, lack of knowledge in technology, lack of educational level, lack of employability skills.
And move on to the next one. Some useful things there that she's saying. But of course, the problem is always, if you've been trained, do you get a job? There, because they have job opportunities from their 700 employers, they've got a good chance of placing people. This project, vocational training program by Madhab Memorial Vocational Training Institute in Bangladesh, was not aimed just at disabled people. This was aimed at getting people into work, and they dealt with upwards of 40,000 people, which included in the vocational training team placements for people with sensory and physical disabilities. There was a multidisciplinary team to help them with vocational training. They had 15 different courses that they could actually take. So it was quite an interesting scheme. What were the outcomes of the study? Well, they did a pre and post test, mainly using qualitative methods. They found improved employment outcomes with 60% of participants securing employment after training. That is a very high figure. We had a project running in the UK last year that the government spent a lot of money on, and less than 1% of the disabled employees who were on it actually got placed in a job. So 60% is very high. Interestingly, the training program was more successful in preparing women for employment than men, 71 to 53%. The study did not explore factors behind the gender difference. Participants who secured employment reported better well-being and quality of life outcomes. 74% reported that they were able to provide better livelihood for their families. 92% reported increased social acceptance, and 83% reported improvements in overall quality of life. So that's quite an interesting finding. And to say a little bit more about it, what were the lessons learned? Although the study found that vocational training can improve employment outcomes, it also highlighted that the training should match participants' skills and abilities and their financial resources. For example, a participant who did a sewing course but could not afford a sewing machine, or a participant who took part in a computer training course but didn't have a computer, could not find jobs because the employers thought their educational background was too low. So you need to secure places for internships, which will, if successful, then lead to a full employment. The other thing there, the need for vocational training to work alongside other schemes such as microfinance, so you can buy your sewing machine or your computer at a low interest rate and pay it back as you start making money. So that's quite an interesting finding there. There's now coming on to Africa again and looking at a project there about inclusion in Nigeria and in Kenya, and we'll be talking to one of the people who's involved in it a bit after this. So first of all, we'll hear from them.
I was called in for an interview. Then I walked in, I was interviewed. Then they asked me the last question. I was like, have you seen anybody here who looks like you? And then I was like, no. Then the interviewee asked me, how do you think that the people in here are going to perceive you, and what kind of picture are you going to portray to our customers?
Most times when I go, I perform well during the interview session, and they tell me they get back to me, and they never get back to me.
The basic challenge I faced when I was looking for employment was when I get into the organization and they look at me and say, can you do the job? No, it's very demoralizing, because if I could go to school, get a master's degree, so why would you ask me if I can do the job?
We don't need pity, we just need to be understood and given a chance to explain ourselves. Some people just stigmatize us because they see us with a white cane or a hearing aid.
My experience, I have always experienced a challenge in communication barrier. Every time I want to get an access to an office, there is that communication barrier.
Many people think they are left out because of the impairments they have, but then it's not correct. They are left out because the workplace is totally not accessible for them.
Living with disability in Nigeria is a serious challenge. In fact, it's what they call double jeopardy. You know, the environment is not friendly. Sometimes the people are not friendly because of some cultural beliefs and all of that. So it makes it a very serious challenge to live as a person with disability in Nigeria. You really have to be a determined person. Like I said, like I'm a go-getter. You need to be a go-getter to survive in this country, and that's the truth.
Yeah, Alan, I don't know what you're doing to the screen, but you've put lots of red marks all over the screen, Alan Hebert. So it's not very helpful, thanks. Okay, so I don't know if you can still read that, but this was produced by the South African Rights Commission Advice for Employers, the don'ts and the do's, and I think it's quite useful to have that read out. So perhaps you could read it out, Sarah. Sarah, you still with us?
I am, Richard.
Okay, can you manage to read it? Yeah.
Yes, I will read it. The do's and the don'ts by the South African Human Rights Commission Advice for Employers.
Okay.
Don't assume that disabled people are unemployable. Instead, do learn where to contact and recruit disabled people. Don't assume that disabled people lack the necessary education and training for employment, but do learn how to communicate with disabled people. Don't assume that disabled people do not want to work. Do ensure that your applications and other company forms do not ask disability-related questions and that they are in formats that are accessible to disabled people. Don't also ask if a person has a disability during an employment interview. Do consider having written job description and identify the essential functions of the job. Don't assume that certain jobs are more suited to disabled people. Instead, do ensure that requirements for medical examinations do not discriminate and eliminate disabled applicants. Don't assume that disabled people can't do a certain job. Do provide reasonable accommodation instead that the qualified applicant will need to compete for the job. The don'ts again, don't assume that your current management will need special training to learn how to work with disabled people. Do treat disabled people the same way you would treat any applicant or employee. And don't assume that the cost of business insurance will increase as a result of hiring disabled people. Do relax and make the disabled applicant feel comfortable. Don't assume that the work environment will be unsafe if you employ disabled people or an employee sustains an impairment while on the job, but do develop procedures for maintaining and protecting confidential medical records. Don't assume also that reasonable accommodation is expensive. Do train supervisors about how to make reasonable accommodations. Don't assume that reasonable accommodation are expensive. Don't make medical judgments, and also don't assume that your workplace is inaccessible.
Thanks very much. And now we're going to, I'm afraid the screen's a bit of a mess. I don't know how this happens, but anyway, we're going to go on with an interview with Elizabeth Umbati, who's involved with the project for Inclusion for Work. But tell us a little bit about the situation in Kenya and workplace before we do the interview, Sarah.
Yeah, okay, I'll talk about disability employment in Kenya, work and livelihoods. And the situation in Kenya is policy-wise very well entrenched in the constitution, where 5% is supposed to be reserved for persons with disability in appointive and elective positions, but that is far to be reached. But on the other hand, we also have programs that are encouraging persons with disabilities to get employed and to get skills for them to be able to improve their livelihoods. Like we have Kazi kwa Vijana, which is work for the youth that encourages even persons with disabilities to apply. Mostly these are work, manual labor works, which some types of disability may not be suitable for. So there is also the Kenya Business and Disability Network, which is the Federation of Kenya Employees, and it calls for inclusion of persons with disabilities when it comes to employment. I will also cite the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis conference for last year, 2020, which was a conference that was looking at work and employment of persons with disabilities as a whole. It was a whole conference. And to actualize this, we will talk to Elizabeth Umbati now, who is a person with disability in Kenya, through the film that you shall see shortly.
Okay, I'll just get it up. Okay.
currently I work as an OPD engagement officer in a project called Inclusion Works. Inclusion Works is a UK government-funded program in 4 countries of Uganda, Nigeria, Kenya, and Bangladesh, whose focus is on how more people with disabilities are included in or access formal wage employment. I'm so happy to be here today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. To start us off, I would like you to tell us what is the position of disabled people in Kenya as regards to employment and both the formal and informal employment, pre and post-COVID status, please.
Thank you, Sarah. So it's widely known, even through studies, that many persons with disabilities are in the formal sector. And they were hugely affected in the pandemic and even now as we are trying to build back better. And studies have shown that. One study showed that in Kenya, 68% of persons with disabilities reported not being able to work, while 65% felt insecurity in their current jobs. And one key recommendation that keeps coming up is that people with disabilities and their families need targeted support around their income or loss of employment or business. Therefore, government should ensure benefits are accessible to persons with disabilities, and in some cases also provide direct support for the relaunching of their businesses. Thank you.
Thank you for that. What are the main barriers to equal employment, according to your view?
Okay, so main barriers, I would list 3. I know there are many more, but we just do 3. So there's the issue of physical inaccessibility. So we have many people with disabilities being hindered, from getting to work due to inaccessible physical environments, looking at also inaccessible public transport that makes it really hard for persons with disabilities to access workplaces, which affects, the outcomes of work and employment. We also look at barriers to do with accessing quality education, where you find that a huge percentage of persons with disabilities not accessing quality education, also affecting the outcome in terms of accessing work, in the open labor market. And also lastly, when we don't have a focus on ensuring reasonable accommodation to persons with disabilities in the workplaces, which also, is a barrier. It poses a barrier in how persons with disabilities can access, but also retain work.
I think we'll move on from there, Sarah, to our second chat session, which, what are the main barriers to disabled people getting into employment in low middle income countries, is number 4. And number 5, what should governments do to improve the employment position of disabled people in your country? So this is very practical, aimed at what are the barriers to employment in your country, and particularly for low and middle income countries. There are people on the call from the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and so on. So you can either answer for your country or for a low and middle income country know of. And what should governments do to improve the employment position of disabled people in your own country, whether you're high or low income? Okay, so we'll give you a minute to, if you can put your number down, 4 and 5, against your answers there in the chat, that would be very useful. So I'll be quiet for a bit while you do that. Thank you very much. So very simply, 4 was barriers to getting into employment, and 5, what could governments do to help it? And have we got some suggestions in the chat now, Gemma? As we've only got about 12 minutes left, I'd like to get started on it.
Okay. Freaky Andrew Essien says the barriers are there. The barriers are that there is no jobs generally, but take the 5% quota for employment provided for in the Prohibition Act seriously. This is a good one. Bruce in Zambia. This is regarding number 4. The government has passed a law that a percentage of jobs in the private and public sectors shall be reserved for persons with disabilities. However, the percentage has never been prescribed, hence the law is unenforceable. Joseph, I'm not sure which country, says lack of skills or enough skills needed in the job market or qualifications. And Leslie Ann, who we heard from earlier, said the main barriers include the attitudes and opinions which are still tied to the medical model of disability. I'm just going to whiz down a bit.
We've got any solutions?
Well, Bruce, who commented above, said the government has been pushed to draft a statutory instrument on employment for persons with disabilities, but it's yet to be finalised by the Ministry of Justice. David said it can be actualised in Uganda by implementation of the existing legal and policy framework. Uganda has a good legal and policy environment. All we need is implementation of these. Let me just whiz down a bit further. Lloyd Childs, who I think is in Dominica, says number 4, stigmas which are still heavily associated with being disabled. And number 5, doing training session to help equip employers with better employment practices as it relates to disabled people. Joseph again says improve the skills training for disabled people. And we had that one, just bear with me one moment. Rachel in Zambia says 30% of government jobs should be reserved for persons with disabilities. Yeah. Somebody who's just put a number, I don't know their name, physical appearance, lack of full information about a person with disability. That's a myth. Queen Seketi, improve access to education, skills, training. Elizabeth says when skills training is conducted, links to employment opportunities must also be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bendina, who I think is in Belize, has answered 4 and 5, but number 5 says provide affordable access to higher education for disabled people and mandate work facilities to a higher percentage of disabled people in their organisation. Somebody else says improved access to formal education and skill acquisitions training. Freaky Andrew says disability awareness training for employers. And David Nangosi, more sensitization of human resource officers on the employment of disabled people. There should be a network, this is somebody else, Alora, there should be a network for disabled people to provide the information for updating skills when it comes to livelihood. And I'm just going to do one more. The government needs to work together with DPOs to run sensitization and disability equality training, as this really helps to deal with the biggest barrier, which is attitudes and myths.
Okay, that's a good lot of things there, but several of them concentrated on we've got the law, but it's just not being implemented. So just as an extra point for people, what would be the best way of getting governments to implement laws that they've already got, but they're not actually putting into practice, such as quotas, making the quota work? We had about 5% in Kenya. Late in the film, we heard about a quota of 5% in India. Or is it 4%? And quotas are around the place. How do we make governments do that? How do we make governments actually make available grant for disabled people to have the training that they need. What's the best way, in the view of people on the call, of making that happen? So you can call that number 6 if you like, but what are your answers to number 6? What's the best way of making these things that are already there actually happen?
You need to give some time now.
Yeah. I'm getting quite a painting on the screen here now. And Bruce seemed to say quite a lot about this. So I'm going to come to Bruce first. How do you think down in Zambia you can actually make the government implement these things?
Do you want me to
get Bruce online?
Bruce, I think you're there, Bruce, aren't you? Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Hey, yeah. Bruce.
So what's your answer to my question there? Obviously, you've got the implementation of the legislation that's already there. What do you think is the best way of making that happen?
Okay, so it's first of all is to understand how the legal framework works. In our country, when a main law is passed, it has to be implemented through regulations, which we call statutory instruments. Yeah. So DPOs need to be very active to ensure that they jump on these clauses and engage government through the minister responsible to issue the regulations. Mm-hmm. And the challenge has been with our regulations that disability is a cross-cutting issue and they must consult the labor movement. And this has delayed the issuance of the percentage because there were concerns that there weren't enough qualified persons with disabilities. But I think that there's need for aggression and a lot more strategic advocacy around how to get this moving. And secondly, to also ensure that the measures, the tax measures and non-tax incentives for the private sector are put in place so that the appetite for them to be able to be inclusive is stimulated.
And the tax incentives, which you mentioned, are cost effective because for a small percentage from the government for employers to take on disabled people who then have an income, it saves the government actually paying out later for social security network for those people. So it is a cost saving if they think of it that way. But yes, thanks for that. Okay, let's take someone else. We've got any other solutions there? How do we make the government implement it? Gemma?
Yes. Okay. So there is a need to establish a department within the Ministry of Labour and Social Services to deal with employment of disabled people rather than placing them under the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services.
Absolutely right, yes.
Create incentives for those who implement the laws and penalties for those who don't.
Yeah.
Nadia, I have a few examples of how deaf young people have campaigned in a variety of ways through social media and TV media to get their word out there. Once a campaign has had over 100,000 signatures, it must be heard in UK Parliament. Yeah. This has been a popular way to get voices heard and to challenge government when they do not meet their own legislation.
Good point. Yeah.
Simon in Kenya says checks and balances mechanisms where disabled people are actively involved. Susan in Uganda says the government should work hand in hand with DPOs and disabled people to see that laws are implemented. Mm-hmm. And Abdul Wahab, I'm not sure where you are, implementing the disability laws they enacted and signed because there's no political will to implement the various laws and conventions.
Okay.
Sorry, there was just another one. Create awareness to employers. Disability Confidence Toolkit. Yeah.
Good. So I think there are a lot of suggestions there which should hopefully help people answer some of the follow-up questions that are in the course book. And we are waiting to see the work that you start sending in, please. One of the members on the course is on today. did this short interview with Gemma, and I've included it. It is UK, but we're taking all around the Commonwealth. I hope many others of you will do up to a 90-second interview on, you can do it yourself on Zoom and then send it to us, or you can ask us to interview you. And we'll do that and include it in later sessions, particularly these seminars, because we want as many different voices as possible. And I appreciate it's not always easy to get your voice across in these chat sessions. So this is another way of getting your voice heard. So let's hear what Laurie has to say.
Yes, please.
Sorry. Yeah, hello, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Laurie. I live in the UK, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about autism and what support can help people, because I've got Asperger's syndrome. Well, I've got mild Asperger's syndrome with obsessional anxiety, and I've received support from an autism charity to help me at work, and I'm lucky enough to have been able to work nearly 20 years now with some support. But my diagnosis has helped me to understand myself and explain myself to managers and colleagues, because although I'm more confident than I was, it's still there because it's a lifelong condition. And what can help generally, I believe, is having more understanding of Asperger's and autism in society, understanding in workplaces, and more funding for more autism specialists, support people, helping people like myself and anyone on the spectrum who's got employment needs, who is able to work but might need some help in certain areas.
I'm going to stop it there, Laurie. Thanks. We were running out of time, but thanks for your contribution.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So to round up, really, what should states be doing and what should we be doing? States should ensure national legislation. That's the first one that we obviously need. Secondly, we need to get the public sector should lead by example. The state parties, as we've said, nearly all in the Commonwealth have signed up to this, need to lead by hiring disabled people in all areas of the public sector. They need to provide incentives to employers to hire workers in the private sector, tax incentives and so on, and a quota system, but with tax breaks and penalties as well where they don't do so. Make available advice on good practice and adaptive technology, usually a free service that should be available to all employers. Public procurement policies, that is government buying things from the private sector. They can insist on disability equality in the people who provide that service, even though it's in the private sector. Where quotas, the state should ensure that they are implemented. That was what we had discussion about. Support entrepreneurship and microfinance. You know, teaching people how to keep simple bookkeeping so they can run their own business is a really easy thing to do. There are lots of apps now that you can get, so you can actually keep your accounts on your mobile phone. You don't have to have someone doing that all the time. You just need to learn how to do it. Job retention and return for those who acquire impairments. Very often people who become disabled during the course of their career are just thrown out of work, and we have to say that shouldn't be happening. They should be rehabilitated and carry on with their job. Support disabled people in sheltered employment to benefit but enter the mainstream labour market. They will do much better there. State encourage employment in the private sector with employers, and we've seen some examples of that in our film. If you didn't watch that, do watch the film for this week, because I think there's some good examples in there. Mainstream technical vocational education training. We had the example from Bangladesh, which shows it can be very effective. Ensure disaggregated data is available so that we know by the types of impairment what's happening. So for instance, in the UK, we know that people with mental health issues, only about 7% are actually having jobs. We know that people with learning difficulties is less than 20%, and we know that people with blind and visually impaired people have a much lower rate of employment than, say, people with physical impairments. It's useful to know these things because they then tell you the barriers. So robust monitoring and evaluation, and build intersectionality, non-discrimination with minorities into the scheme. So taking on women with disabilities or ethnic minorities with disabilities or particular underrepresented impairment groups are all very important things. And I'm going to ask Sarah to shut the session by reading out 3 quotes and giving us something to think about at the end of this course. Sarah.
Yeah, I will read some quotations from very renowned people who, like Franklin D. Roosevelt, said that we know that equality of individuals' ability has never existed and never will, but we do insist that equality of opportunity still must be sought. There is Helen Keller, who says, optimism is the faith that leads to achievement. Nothing can be done without hope and confidence. And again, a quote from the Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, that people with disabilities deserve the chance to build a life for themselves in the communities which they choose to live. All this show us that we need to be more proactive as people to be able to fit in society, because it doesn't just come on a silver platter. We need to fight for our rights. We need to fight for inclusion and be heard at all costs. So let's put that out in our governments so that we can be able to have them even implement the policies that they have not done so. Thank you.
And thank you. Coming to the end now. If people want to put their cameras on so we can say hello and goodbye to each other, but several things I want to say about the course. I think it's great that so many of you are still participating. I would like to start getting work in from the follow-up activities from you. Gemma's been sending out how to do that. So can you start sending it in for the modules? We'll send it out again for next week so you know exactly where to send it to. We need to monitor in some ways, those of you who want more than the minimum accreditation, what you're actually doing. So we need that. And we also need, as I said, more input from all of you as the alumni of this course. So if you want to make a little video, 90 seconds on your phone, and send it to us, we will either be able to use that, or one feature that's coming up. You know, we've still got a lot of modules coming up. We've got environment next week. So if some people want to do stuff on the impact on environment on them as disabled people by Tuesday and send it in, that's great. We've got stigma and the media and discrimination the week after. And we've got youth and disability the week after Easter, inclusive education, women and girls, anti-racism, data, and then building our organizations and influencing government. So if you've got anything that's useful around all of that, please get it and send it in. If you know of films that have been made in your country which illustrate a good point, let's have that in as well. Sarah told me some of her colleagues are saying there's not enough African stuff in this. Well, actually, I think there's been quite a lot of African stuff in today. We probably have less representation from the small island countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific. So those of you who are on from there, if you've got anything that you'd like to share, we'd also like that. So I'd like to thank you all for hanging in there and with the course. We think it's going very well. And I'd like to thank you all for your participation. I'd like to thank the signers, the captioners, and most of all, Gemma, for making sure everything works behind the scenes, and for my colleague, Sarah, for today. So thank you very much, and goodbye to you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Audio now unmuted.